Before Rome became the mighty empire we recognize today, it was a republic on the verge of self-destruction. The Senate was paralyzed by corruption. Politicians spent more time sabotaging each other than serving the people, and generals raised armies not for Rome, but for their own ambitions. Civil wars erupted one after another, leaving the streets stained with blood and the future of the republic hanging by a thread. Ordinary citizens were caught between power-hungry elites, the treasury was collapsing, and the very idea of Roman unity was fading into chaos. Rome was still called a republic, but the soul of that republic was dying. And then, from this turmoil, emerged one man whose brilliance seemed almost unnatural. Gaius Julius Caesar, politician, general, orator, visionary. A man who understood the language of the Senate as easily as he understood the cries of soldiers on the battlefield. A man who could win loyalty with his words, reshape alliances with a smile, and take risks that no other Roman would dare to imagine. Caesar did not rise to power gently. He stormed into history with a force that terrified his enemies and inspired his supporters. He brought Rome victories in Gaul that expanded the borders of the Republic farther than ever before. He returned to Rome not as a senator begging for approval, but as a commander beloved by his troops and feared by his rivals. And when the Republic stood again at the edge of collapse, he seized control, restoring order, pushing through reforms, and reshaping Rome's future with breathtaking speed and audacity. Yet the story of Julius Caesar is not just a story of triumph. It is a tragedy carved into the heart of Roman history. For as Caesar rose higher, the Senate felt their power slipping away. What the people saw as a savior, the senators saw as a tyrant. What the crowds celebrated, the elites feared. Caesar built and repaired. But in doing so, he changed the very structure of the Republic. And change, especially in Rome, always came with a price. The man who saved Rome from anarchy would soon be surrounded by conspirators who believed they were saving Rome from him. So before we begin this journey, before we stand with Caesar on the battlefields of Gaul, walk beside him as he crosses the Rubicon and witness the daggers that ended his life, I want to ask you one question. Was Caesar a hero who rescued Rome from collapse, or a dictator who destroyed its ancient freedoms? Your answer may change as we travel deeper into this story. So stay with me, traveler. Like the Romans once did, step into the arena of power, ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. Because our journey into the life and death of Julius Caesar begins now. To understand the rise of Julius Caesar, the man who would one day reshape the destiny of Rome, we must first step back into the world. He was born into a city of marble pride and clay foundations, a republic boasting of virtue yet rotting with division, and a society where one's name was both a blessing and a burden. Caesar did not enter this world as a conqueror, but as a child born into one of Rome's most ancient families, the Julii noble in blood, proud in pedigree, and wrapped in legends older than the Republic itself. From the moment he drew breath, Caesar carried the weight of ancestry that whispered of greatness. The Julii claimed descent from Iulus, the son of Aeneas the Trojan hero, who fled the burning ruins of Troy and, guided by the gods, sailed toward Italy to lay the mythical foundation of Rome. And Aeneas, according to Roman legend, was the son of Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and irresistible allure. Thus, by the time Caesar was born in 100 BCE, he was already woven into a tapestry of divine stories. His family name, Caesar, carried echoes of destiny. His lineage traced back to a goddess. Whether or not he personally believed these legends, Rome did. And in Rome, myth mattered. It shaped identity It shaped politics. It shaped fate. Yet despite this divine heritage, Caesar's branch of the Julii was not wealthy. They were patricians by blood, but their fortunes had dwindled. His father, Gaius Julius Caesar the Elder, was a respected but politically modest figure. His mother, Aurelia, came from the influential Aurelii Cade family, known for discipline, prestige, and strong character. Many ancient writers say that Aurelia was the true force behind Caesar's upbringing, a woman of intelligence and severity who carved discipline into her son's bones and ensured he grew not just noble in birth, but refined in mind. In the household of Aurelia Caesar learned early the values of ambition, restraint, and most importantly, the art of survival. For Rome was not a gentle teacher. When Caesar was born, the Roman Republic was a magnificent illusion, glorious in appearance, but trembling underneath. The streets buzzed with political tension. Senators boasted of serving the people, yet most served only themselves. The divide between patricians, the old aristocratic families, and plebeians, the common citizens, was deep and bitter. The city was a battleground, not of swords, but of influence, corruption, and rhetoric. At every corner of the forum, someone was scheming. Alliances were temporary. Loyalty was conditional. Power was everything. Into this volatile world stepped a young boy who would one day claim to reshape it all. Rome during Caesar's childhood was torn between two opposing visions of the Republic. On one side were the optimates, the conservative aristocrats who believed they were guardians of the old Roman order. They sought to protect tradition and preserve the power of the Senate. To them, change was a threat, reform was weakness, and the common people were a resource to be controlled, not empowered. On the other side were the populares, the champions of the people, politicians, who appealed directly to the masses, bypassing the Senate and promising reforms that threatened elite authority. The populares argued that Rome was dying from inequality, that citizens were starving while senators grew rich, and that the Republic needed bold systemic change. It was a clash not just of politics, but of ideology. And Caesar's family, though patrician, had long been aligned with the populares. His aunt Julia was married to Gaius Marius, one of the most powerful generals in Roman history, a man who rose from humble origins to reshape the Roman army and challenge the aristocracy. Marius was adored by the people, despised by the nobles, and feared by everyone. Young Caesar grew up hearing stories of his uncle's victories, reforms, and battles against the conservative order of Rome. Those stories shaped him, but admiration came with danger. When Caesar was still a teenager, Marius's conflict with the Optimates exploded into civil war. The ruthless general, Sulla leader of the conservatives, marched on Rome with an army and unleashed a reign of terror known as the proscription's public lists of enemies marked for execution. Caesar, as Marius's relative, was suddenly a target. His family name, once a symbol of prestige, became a death sentence. Sulla, cold and cunning, ordered Caesar to divorce his young wife Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, another populist leader. To Sulla, the marriage made Caesar politically dangerous. But Caesar refused a decision astonishingly bold for a teenager facing the wrath of the most powerful man in Rome. Sulla could have killed him. Many urged him to. But instead, he relented grudgingly, saying, "There are many Mariuses in Caesar," a chilling warning that even in youth, Caesar carried the seeds of something formidable. Caesar fled Rome soon after to escape further threats, beginning a journey that would harden him, sharpen him, and transform him from a vulnerable patrician youth into something far more dangerous, a survivor. These early years shaped Caesar more than any battlefield ever could. He learned how fragile power was, how quickly fortunes could turn, and how vital it was to command loyalty, not just through blood, but through charisma and conviction. He saw firsthand the brutality of Roman politics, the corruption, the betrayals, the violence carried out in the name of defending the Republic. He understood that Rome was an arena where only those who mastered both the sword and the tongue could rise. And he learned that every step toward greatness demanded sacrifice. But perhaps the most important lesson Caesar learned in his youth was this: Rome was broken, and only someone bold enough to confront its divisions could save it. The Republic's noble ideals were drowning in greed. Senators enriched themselves while veterans starved. Elections were bought with gold. Laws were twisted for personal gain. Caesar, even as a young man, saw the Republic not as a sacred institution, but as a flawed system desperately in need of transformation. And he believed he could be the one to do it. Caesar's childhood was not marked by the luxury one might expect from a family of ancient lineage. Instead, it was marked by political turmoil, fear, ambition, and the constant reminder that greatness was not inherited, it had to be seized. Every story of his divine ancestry, every whisper of Venus's blood in his veins, every family legend about Aeneas sailing across stormy seas, all of it built within him a sense of destiny that would ignite into action as soon as he stepped onto the stage of Roman politics. But destiny is never enough on its own. Caesar's early life taught him resilience, adaptability, and the art of surviving chaos. He learned to navigate the treacherous currents of the Republic, to read the ambitions of men, and to understand that power in Rome came not from titles, but from the ability to command hearts. And in the years to come, Julius Caesar would show Rome and the world that he had mastered that art like no one before him. His childhood had forged him. The Republic had awakened him. Now Rome's future was waiting for him to step into the light. When Julius Caesar fled Rome to escape Sulla's wrath, he did not leave as a warrior or a hero, but as a marked man, young, vulnerable, stripped of protection, and hunted for the blood that flowed through his veins. It is one of the most extraordinary paradoxes of his life. The man who would one day command legions and reshape the Republic began his adulthood as an outlaw, wandering through Italy's countryside with a price on his head. Sulla's soldiers searched for him relentlessly. Friends begged him to submit and divorce Cornelia, to sacrifice his marriage and save his life. But Caesar refused, driven by a stubborn courage that bordered on defiance. This was the first defining moment of Caesar's character. Not a battlefield triumph, not a speech in the forum, but a quiet personal decision to protect his marriage and his dignity at the risk of everything. That refusal became the spark that ignited the rest of his life. Caesar fled from safe house to safe house, hiding among sympathetic families and traveling under cover of darkness. In one account, he was captured by Sulla's men and released only after a bribe from influential friends, an act that reminded him painfully of how fragile life was when power lay in the hands of tyrants. When Sulla finally relented, granting him a reluctant pardon, he did so with a warning that echoed through Rome: there are many Mariuses in Caesar. It was as if Sulla could already see the storm Caesar would one day unleash. Caesar did not forget those words. They became a shadow that followed him for years, pushing him, challenging him, and reminding him that fate had marked him from the beginning. With danger still lingering in the capital, Caesar left Rome and joined the army serving in Asia and Cilicia. For someone born into nobility, military service was usually a stepping stone, an opportunity to gain reputation and favor. For Caesar, it became something more. It was liberation. Away from Rome's conspiracies and political daggers, he found a world of action, honor, and clarity. He fought with distinction during the siege of Mytilene, earning a civic crown, a rare and prestigious honor awarded only to those who saved the life of a fellow Roman soldier. Caesar, barely in his early 20s, risked his life not for glory, but because courage came to him naturally. It was as instinctive as breathing. Yet Rome called to him. The city's politics, its shifting power, its promises of influence, all of it pulled him back like gravity. When Sulla died, Caesar returned to Rome and began the slow, careful construction of his public image. He did not storm into politics with brash ambition. Instead, he entered like a craftsman, shaping a masterpiece, methodically, deliberately, understanding that in Rome, reputation was the currency of power. His first battlefield was not a frontier province, but the courts. Caesar became a lawyer, not a dusty scholar, buried in scrolls, but a performer, a master of drama, whose voice could silence crowds and ignite passions. In the Roman Forum, he discovered that words were weapons sharper than swords and far more devastating. He prosecuted corrupt governors with fiery eloquence, exposing their greed, cruelty, and extortion. His speeches were not dry legal arguments. They were emotional assaults, theatrical displays of indignation that stirred the people and terrified the guilty. Even at this young age, Caesar possessed a magnetic charisma. When he spoke, Rome listened. He had the ability to turn a trial into a spectacle and a legal challenge into a moral crusade. His style was bold, sometimes too bold. He wore his toga with an elegance that bordered on vanity. He spoke with passion rather than restraint. He let his ambition show. In a society where subtlety was a virtue, Caesar embraced brilliance. His peers whispered that he was dangerous. His supporters whispered that he was destined. Both were right. To broaden his horizons, Caesar traveled to Rhodes to study rhetoric under the famed teacher Apollonius Milon, the same man who taught Cicero. But fate intervened in dramatic fashion. On his journey, Caesar's ship was captured by pirates. Most men would despair, plead, or negotiate. Caesar did none of that. Instead, he behaved like a man who was already a king. He joked with the pirates, demanded they increase his ransom because he was worth more, and warned them calmly that when he was freed, he would return and crucify them. The pirates laughed, but when Caesar was ransomed and released, he immediately gathered a small fleet, hunted down the pirates, captured them, and personally oversaw their execution. This episode revealed something the world would come to fear. Caesar did not bluff. He did not forget, and he did not forgive betrayal. Returning to Rome once again, Caesar resumed his political climb with renewed confidence. His early magistracies showcased his talent for connecting with the masses. He served as a military tribune, then as quaestor in Spain, where he saw firsthand the wealth and potential of Rome's provinces. In Spain, Caesar stood before a statue of Alexander the Great and felt a surge of shame. He was in his early 30s, an age at which Alexander had conquered the world, and yet Caesar was only beginning his ascent. This moment, recorded by ancient historians, fueled an ambition that would burn brighter than ever before. He vowed to match, not merely admire, greatness. Upon returning to Rome, he leveraged his growing popularity to pursue the next steps in his political career. His alignment with the populares grew stronger. Caesar understood the power of the people, not just as voters, but as a force capable of overturning senatorial control. He sponsored public games, supported reforms, defended popular leaders, and cultivated a public image that blurred the line between politician and champion. His generosity became legendary. He borrowed enormous sums of money to fund lavish feasts and spectacles. Critics mocked his extravagance. Supporters adored him. Caesar knew what he was doing. He was buying loyalty, crafting myth, and building an army, not of soldiers, but of Roman citizens who saw him as their defender. Caesar's charisma, however, also caught the attention of Rome's most powerful figures. The Senate, already suspicious of his family ties and populist leanings, began to fear his rising influence. Yet Caesar, with precision and charm, maneuvered through political factions, forming alliances where necessary and avoiding conflict when it offered no advantage. He understood that the Republic was a chessboard, and every move had to be calculated, every alliance temporary, every victory strategic. His appointment as aedile marked a turning point. As aedile Caesar staged festivals, games, and public entertainments on a scale Rome had never seen. He filled the city with gladiator shows, theatrical performances, and exquisite decorations. He poured money into restoring public buildings and beautifying Rome's streets. Citizens cheered him at every corner. Senators scowled at the extravagance. But Caesar did not care. He was not merely entertaining the masses, he was shaping identity. He was becoming the face of a new Rome, one that resonated with the people rather than the aristocracy. His political ascent culminated in his election as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, a position of immense religious and cultural significance. Many believed Caesar was too young, too indebted, too audacious for such a sacred office. Yet he won not through tradition, but through popularity. It was a clear signal that Caesar had become a force the Republic could no longer ignore. From outlaw to lawyer, from pirate captive to avenger, from ambitious tribune to Rome's chief priest, Caesar's early journey was a testament to resilience, charisma, and strategic genius. He had survived Sulla, mastered rhetoric, captured the hearts of the people, and embedded himself deep within Rome's political machinery. But these early years were only the foundation. The storms of ambition, rivalry, and destiny were gathering. Ahead lay alliances that would shake the Republic, campaigns that would redefine Rome, and choices that would lead Caesar toward both immortality and assassination. When Julius Caesar completed his earliest steps in politics, navigating danger under Sulla, building a reputation in the courts, and shaping his public persona, he was still missing one crucial piece of the Roman ideal: military distinction. In Rome, true authority did not come from birth alone. Nobility gave a man a name, but military glory gave him immortality. Caesar understood this deeply, and so when the political climate stabilized after Sulla's death, he turned toward the one arena where ambition, courage, and destiny could collide: the battlefield. His entry into the Roman army was not a glamorous parade or a triumphant appointment. It was a necessity, a strategic step, and to some degree, an escape. Rome was still riddled with political traps, rivalries, and jealous senators waiting for him to stumble. The provinces, by contrast, offered action opportunities and the possibility of forging a reputation untainted by the Senate's schemes. Caesar joined the staff of Marcus Thermus, the governor of Asia, where Rome was engaged in conflicts with local cities and rebellious communities. It was here in Asia Minor that Caesar first tasted the rhythm of military life, the camaraderie of soldiers, and the adrenaline of combat. He was young, ambitious, and untested, but he carried something far more valuable than experience and instinct for leadership. Caesar's first notable moment came during the siege of Mytilene, a Greek city on the island of Lesbos that had rebelled against Roman rule. While most young nobles would have sought safety behind the ranks, Caesar threw himself into danger. His courage was not reckless bravado. It was controlled, deliberate, born from the belief that greatness required risk. According to ancient accounts, Caesar personally rescued a fellow Roman soldier during a fierce assault, earning the civic crown, one of Rome's rarest military decorations. This honor was not given lightly. Only those who saved a Roman citizen's life in battle could wear it, and even then, only with the approval of the entire army. When Caesar returned from Asia Minor, wearing the simple oak wreath, all Rome knew what it meant. This young man had courage, talent, and the spirit of a hero. But the most defining moment of his early military career was still to come, a story so legendary, so astonishing, that it would be retold for centuries. While traveling to Rhodes to study rhetoric under the renowned Apollonius Milon, the same master who once trained Cicero Caesar's ship was intercepted by pirates near the island of Pharmacusa. Pirates in the Mediterranean were notorious, violent, and feared by all. They raided coastal towns, captured wealthy Romans for ransom, and often murdered their prisoners, even after receiving payment. When Caesar was seized, the pirates believed they had captured a wealthy young aristocrat worth a substantial sum. They were right, but they had no idea that they had also captured a man who would one day dominate the world. The moment Caesar set foot on their ship, the balance shifted. Instead of trembling before his captors, he behaved as if he were their commander. When the pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents, Caesar laughed. He told them they clearly did not know who he was and insisted that they demand 50 talents instead. The pirates, amused by the arrogance of their captive, agreed. And thus began one of the strangest and most revealing episodes in Caesar's life. For the 38 days he remained captive, Caesar treated the pirates not as masters, but as subordinates. He read them his poems and speeches, scolding them whenever they failed to appreciate his talent. He exercised with his entourage, ordered the pirates to be quiet when he slept, and even joined in their games, all while reminding them half-jokingly that he would return and crucify them. They laughed every time he said it. But to Caesar, it was not a joke. The pirates saw a charming, quick-witted nobleman. They did not see the steel beneath the charm, the iron will that would one day conquer Gaul, cross the Rubicon, and topple the Republic. Caesar spent those days observing them, learning their routines, studying their defenses, and waiting. When his associates finally arrived with the ransom money, Caesar was released. Most men would have returned home grateful to be alive, eager to resume their studies. Caesar was not most men. Immediately after his release, he sailed to the nearby cities and demanded a small fleet. Whether they complied out of respect, fear, or fascination remains unknown. What matters is that Caesar obtained the ships he needed. Then, without hesitation, he set sail to hunt down the pirates. He found them exactly where he had left them. Taken completely by surprise, the pirates were overwhelmed and captured with ease. Caesar reclaimed every last talent of ransom money and brought the prisoners back to the authorities. But Roman officials hesitated. They wanted to follow legal procedures, hold formal trials, and perhaps even profit from the prisoners. Caesar had no patience for bureaucratic delay. He took matters into his own hands. He went to the prison, ordered the pirates removed, and personally carried out the sentence he had promised them: crucifixion. According to some accounts, he mercifully cut their throats before crucifying them, an act of grim compassion that reveals the complexity of his character. He was capable of mercy, but also capable of ruthless justice. He kept his word. He demonstrated his authority. And he proved that he was not a young noble to be toyed with, but a force to be feared. This episode became legendary in Rome, spreading his name across the Mediterranean, not as a student or lawyer, but as a man who could not be intimidated, who could not be defeated, who honored his oaths even to enemies. After completing his studies in Rhodes and solidifying his reputation as both soldier and avenger, Caesar returned to Rome with a newfound confidence. He was no longer the young survivor fleeing Sulla's wrath. He was no longer the lawyer struggling for recognition in the forum. He had become a man marked by experience, sharpened by danger, and tested by fate. His time in Asia Minor and his confrontation with pirates became the foundation of his identity as a leader, bold, decisive, unafraid of blood, yet never senselessly cruel. He understood power in a way few others did. He had learned that fear could be leveraged, respect earned, and loyalty commanded. But the greatest lesson was internal. Caesar realized he was destined for something far greater than rhetoric or minor political offices. He felt within himself the stirrings of a world-shaping destiny. Rome would be his battlefield. The Republic would be his stage. His military achievements, though small compared to what he would later accomplish, gave him invaluable experience in command logistics and strategy. They also strengthened his connection to the Roman people. Soldiers spoke of him with admiration. Sailors whispered his name with awe. Governors recognized that he was a rising star. And in Rome, a city that thrived on reputation, Caesar's legend grew. He had survived dictatorship, won honor in battle, faced pirates with defiance, and returned victorious. The stage was set. Caesar now prepared to pursue higher magistracies, greater political influence, and alliances that would push him closer to power. His journey from Asia Minor back to the heart of the Republic marked the end of his apprenticeship and the beginning of his ascent. Ahead lay gladiatorial games, electoral victories, political theaters, and the dangerous, exhilarating road toward the consulship and ultimately toward the dictatorship that would change Rome forever. As Julius Caesar returned to Rome after proving himself in Asia Minor, he stepped back into a political arena far more treacherous than any battlefield he had faced. Rome was a city of masks, where ambition flowed through every marble corridor, where alliances shifted like sand, and where a man's future depended not on merit alone, but on perception, influence, and the delicate art of persuasion. Caesar understood this world instinctively. The young soldier who once confronted pirates with fearless arrogance now transformed into a political strategist who would bend the Republic's institutions to his will, not through brute force, but through charm, eloquence, and the calculated deployment of debt. In Rome, to rise quickly meant spending lavishly. Elections, games, public banquets, and generous favors were the currency of influence. Caesar possessed charisma and intellect in abundance, but he lacked the wealth required to compete with Rome's entrenched aristocracy. Yet instead of accepting the limits of his finances, he chose a different path. He borrowed. And then he borrowed more, and more still. Every coin he spent, every debt he signed, every creditor he approached, moved him one step closer to political greatness. Behind the dazzling smile, the bold speeches, and the public generosity, Caesar was quietly building the most dangerous financial empire in Rome, one that intertwined his destiny with the most powerful financiers of the Republic. It was said that Caesar owed money to nearly every banker in Rome, and although his enemies mocked him for it, his supporters understood the truth. Caesar was investing in himself and his future, in the vision he carried within him. Debt to Caesar was not a burden, but a weapon. His meteoric rise cannot be understood without acknowledging the role of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Crassus was drawn to Caesar not out of friendship, but out of calculation. He recognized in the young politician something rare, extraordinary potential paired with extraordinary ambition. Crassus became Caesar's silent patron, paying off portions of his debt, funding his campaigns, and shielding him from financial ruin. In exchange, Caesar offered something even more valuable: political support, connections to the masses, and the ability to shape public opinion. Together, the soldier poet and the oligarch formed a formidable alliance. Caesar, the rising star beloved by the people, and Crassus, the billionaire kingmaker who needed a charismatic frontman to counterbalance rivals like Pompey the Great. If Rome was a chessboard, then Caesar had found his queen a powerful piece capable of altering the game entirely. But alliances alone were not enough. Caesar needed something that no amount of wealth could buy the hearts and minds of the Roman people. Before he was a general, before he was a dictator, Caesar was an orator, a master of language, whose voice could sway juries, silence senators, and ignite the passions of an entire city. In a republic, where politics unfolded not behind closed doors, but in open forums before thousands of citizens, the ability to speak well was as powerful as any legion. Caesar honed this skill with relentless dedication. He studied in Rhodes under Apollonius Milan, one of the greatest teachers of rhetoric in the ancient world. Cicero himself, the preeminent orator of Rome, would later admit that Caesar's speaking style was majestic, splendid, and smooth, a rare acknowledgement from a man who rarely praised his rivals. What made Caesar's speech so powerful was not flowery language or theatrical gestures, but sincerity. He did not speak to the people he spoke to them. He made them feel heard. He made them feel important. In a republic dominated by aristocrats who acted as though the masses were a burden to endure, Caesar treated the public with respect. He promised reforms, justice, and recognition. His voice became the voice of the overlooked. When Caesar prosecuted corrupt governors, he did not merely argue cases. He exposed the cruelty and greed of Rome's elite. When he spoke in the forum, crowds gathered not just to hear his words, but to witness the force of his personality. He wove stories, logic, humor, and outrage together with perfect timing. He attacked opponents without appearing cruel. He defended allies with a loyalty that inspired admiration. And when he made promises, he spoke with such conviction that even skeptics found themselves wanting to believe him. Caesar's oratory became a political weapon, sharper than any sword. Through his speeches, he connected directly with Rome's plebeians, the shopkeepers, the farmers, the laborers, the veterans. These people did not read laws or study politics. They listened, they felt, and Caesar gave them a champion. He became the politician who could make a crowd roar, who could turn a trial into theater, who could turn a policy into a rallying cry. Rome had senators who could fight. Rome had generals who could conquer. But Rome had only one Caesar, an orator who could command loyalty with his voice alone. It was this extraordinary talent that laid the foundation for his eventual dominance. But even the most gifted speaker needed resources to maintain momentum. And so, Caesar leaned deeper into the one strategy that had carried him this far dead. Caesar's ascent was not only rooted in his ability to move the masses, it was equally dependent on his strategic relationship with Rome's business class, the equestrians, the tax collectors, the merchants, and the financial syndicates who powered the republic's economy. These men were not aristocrats. They did not care about ancient bloodlines or noble traditions. They cared about profit, and Caesar understood this better than any politician of his generation. The Senate often antagonized the business class with regulations, taxes, and unpredictable political infighting. Caesar, in contrast, offered partnership. He promised stability. He promised protection. He promised expansion, new provinces, new trade routes, new opportunities for wealth. When Caesar ran for the position of aedile, a major step in the political ladder, he spent astronomical sums organizing festivals, games, and public banquets. He built massive structures overnight, filled the forum with decorations, and displayed the spoils of past generals. Rome had never witnessed such grand spectacles. The people adored him for it. But behind the scenes, merchants and financiers saw something else. This was a man who could turn generosity into political power, who could unite the masses behind him, who could reshape the republic. And so they backed him. They funded him. They protected him. Every lavish celebration Caesar hosted was an investment. Every public performance was a declaration that he was different from the stale aristocracy dominating Rome. People whispered that Caesar was drowning in debt, that he owed more money than any politician in living memory. They were right. Caesar's debts were monstrous. But debts did not frighten him. He believed in his future, believed that power would repay every coin 100-fold. For the businessmen, this was a gamble worth taking. Caesar represented growth. Caesar represented opportunity. Caesar represented change. And for the common people, he represented hope, a leader who saw them not as tools or numbers, but as citizens worthy of dignity. This dual support from the working masses and the financial elite made Caesar uniquely untouchable. Senators feared him, rivals envied him, voters adored him, and money flowed into his campaign coffers like water down the Tiber. By the time he completed his term as Ides Caesar was both wildly popular and deeply indebted. But this combination, paradoxically, made him unstoppable. The people saw him as their champion. The businessmen saw him as their golden ticket. And Rome saw him as a rising comet. His every move, every word, every debt, every alliance was another step toward the consulship, toward the height of Roman power. What Caesar built during these years was not simply a career. It was a movement, a force of political gravity, unlike anything the Republic had ever witnessed. By the time Caesar began eyeing the highest offices of Rome, the Republic stood on the edge of a political storm. Two giants towered above the Roman landscape: Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, a man worshipped by his troops and adored by the public, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's richest man, the oligarch whose wealth could feed entire cities and whose influence stretched into every bank and tax syndicate of the Republic. The irony, however, was that Pompey and Crassus despised one another. Their rivalry was legendary. Pompey saw Crassus as a greedy merchant pretending to be a statesman. Crassus saw Pompey as an overpraised warlord who stole glory rather than earned it. Between them lay a gulf so deep that even the Senate avoided placing them in the same political space. Yet Caesar, with the instincts of a political savant, understood something that no one else in Rome could fully grasp. Rome was no longer ruled by laws or traditions. It was ruled by the men who could manipulate alliances. Caesar saw that if Pompey and Crassus remained enemies, the Senate would control Rome. But if they could be brought together, even temporarily, the Republic would tremble. And Caesar, positioned between them, could rise to heights no man had reached in a generation. It was a bold thought, almost laughable in its audacity. But audacity was Caesar's native language. The political environment made the moment perfect for such a daring move. Pompey, returning from his eastern campaigns, wanted the Senate to ratify his settlements and grant land to his veterans. But the Senate, jealous of his success, rejected him. Crassus wanted relief for the tax farming companies whose bids had collapsed during economic turmoil. Again, the Senate refused. Both men were powerful. Both were humiliated. Both were furious. And Caesar saw, in their anger, the opening he needed. At this moment, he was a rising figure deeply in debt, charming the masses, building momentum, but lacking the raw power necessary to break through Rome's aristocratic barriers. He needed allies. But more importantly, he needed these two specific allies. Pompey offered military prestige and unmatched popularity. Crassus offered financial backing and the support of Rome's business class. Caesar alone offered something neither could achieve without him: reconciliation. He became the bridge, the negotiator, the charismatic thread connecting two pillars that would otherwise collapse the entire political structure. And so he approached them quietly, not as a supplicant, but as a strategist, laying out a grand design. To understand Caesar's brilliance, we must understand Pompey's ambition. Pompey had conquered vast territories in the east, Syria, Judea, Asia Minor, reshaping the geopolitical map. He returned to Rome, expecting gratitude, expecting celebration, expecting the Senate to honor him as a second Alexander. Instead, he found coldness, suspicion, jealousy. The Senate resented his popularity. They feared his army. They hated his influence. They denied almost every proposal he put forward, even those meant to reward his veterans, men who had bled and sacrificed for Rome. Pompey felt humiliated, betrayed by the very aristocrats he once defended. Beneath the polished marble of the Senate House, he felt the chill of political isolation. He was powerful, yes, but increasingly powerless within the Senate's walls. And this wounded pride made him vulnerable. Caesar understood Pompey intimately. He had served under him briefly in earlier campaigns. He admired him. But more importantly, he understood Pompey's psychology. The great general wanted recognition, legitimacy, and unwavering loyalty. Caesar could offer all of that. So he approached Pompey and offered him what the Senate refused: the ratification of his eastern settlements, the land for his veterans, and the political partnership he desperately lacked. Caesar promised Pompey restoration of his glory and solidarity. Pompey accepted, not realizing that in that moment he had entered a political equation where Caesar was the constant and he was merely a variable. If Pompey represented prestige, Crassus represented power of an entirely different kind. He controlled tax contracts, firefighting syndicates, mines, real estate, and loan networks across the Republic. He was, without exaggeration, the wealthiest man Rome had ever produced. But though money could buy him influence, it could not buy him legacy. Crassus envied Pompey's military fame. He wanted victory. He wanted monuments. He wanted history to remember him not as a banker, but as a conqueror and statesman. And like Pompey, he too was frustrated by the Senate's refusal to support his interests. The publicani, the tax farming corporations, had overbid on contracts in Asia and were now sinking into financial ruin. Crassus needed the Senate to revise the terms to save the companies and his own investments. But the aristocrats, driven by spite, humiliated him by blocking every move. Crassus, like Pompey, was growing tired of the Senate's games, and Caesar knew exactly how to exploit this. Caesar offered him what he craved: influence reform and a chance to secure the loyalty of the business class through legislative victories. Crassus also understood something Pompey did not. Caesar was not merely useful, he was necessary. Caesar had the charisma to win elections, the popularity to pass laws, and the daring to challenge the Senate's authority. Crassus agreed to Caesar's plan, not just because he believed in it, but because he recognized that Caesar was the only man capable of reshaping Rome in a way that benefited them all. And so the richest man in Rome aligned himself with the man who possessed nothing but debts and ambition. While Pompey and Crassus joined this alliance out of frustration and strategic necessity, Caesar joined with a far more expansive vision. He was not content with minor reforms or temporary victories. He wanted the consulship, the pinnacle of Roman politics. But Caesar also saw beyond that. He wanted control of a province, after his term, preferably one with military potential. He wanted armies' victories and the chance to prove himself on a scale that would match or surpass Pompey's achievements. Caesar played his role masterfully. To Pompey, he offered loyalty. To Crassus, he offered legislation. To both, he offered mediation. But behind the charm, behind the alliances, behind the smiles he gave at dinner parties and political rallies, Caesar was weaving a web in which he would sit at the center. He knew Pompey needed him. He knew Crassus trusted him. And he knew that once the triumvirate was formed, he would be the one holding it together. The Senate, horrified, called it a conspiracy against the Republic. They were right. The first triumvirate was not an official legal body. It was a private pact, a shadow government controlled by three men who combined military power, wealth, and popularity into one unstoppable force. Caesar was elected consul in 59 BCE, a victory made possible by this alliance. Once in office, he moved quickly. He passed land reforms for Pompey's veterans. He secured financial relief for Crassus, and he positioned himself as the champion of the people. His debt, once a burden, became irrelevant. His enemies, once powerful, became silent. And his allies, once dominant, became dependent on him. The alliance had begun as a partnership. But it soon became clear that Caesar was its true architect, an ultimate beneficiary. Historians often debate the goals of the triumvirate. Some say it was a political necessity. Others call it a coup. But at its core, the first triumvirate aligned three men whose ambitions were too large for the Senate to contain. Pompey wanted legitimacy. Crassus wanted influence. Caesar wanted destiny. And Caesar, through sheer force of personality, vision, and political brilliance, bound these three ambitions into one unstoppable coalition. Together, they controlled elections, legislation, military appointments, and provincial assignments. They bypassed the Senate with ease. They dominated Rome so thoroughly that the Republic's traditional checks and balances collapsed under the weight of their combined power. But it was Caesar who saw the furthest. He knew the alliance was temporary. He knew Pompey and Crassus would eventually clash again. But until then, he would use them carefully, skillfully, to build his base of power. What Caesar gained from the triumvirate was priceless: the consulship, the loyalty of Pompey's veterans, the wealth of Crassus, and eventually, most importantly, the proconsular command in Gaul, where his destiny awaited. The first triumvirate was the spark. Gaul would be the wildfire. When Julius Caesar secured the proconsular command of Gaul in 58 BCE, many senators believed they had outmaneuvered him. They assumed the appointment was a political exile disguised as a promotion, a way to push Caesar far from Rome, away from his supporters, and into a remote frontier where he would spend years dealing with barbarians rather than influencing politics. What they failed to understand was that Gaul was not a burial ground for ambition. It was an unopened treasure chest, one filled with glory, gold, and endless opportunities for a military genius like Caesar. The Senate expected him to manage the region quietly, to protect Rome's borders, and to maintain peace. Caesar, however, had no intention of being quiet. Gaul, vast, wild, divided, and deeply unstable, was the perfect stage on which he could craft a legend. As he left Rome officially to assume a routine governorship, he carried with him something far more dangerous than authority. He carried purpose. And the moment he crossed into the Gallic lands, that purpose ignited into one of the most extraordinary military campaigns the ancient world had ever seen. Caesar's command included Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum regions that placed him at the doorstep of a sprawling territory inhabited by dozens of tribes who shared culture but rarely unity. The Senate believed Caesar would spend his term mediating disputes among these tribes. Caesar believed otherwise. He saw the region with the eyes of a visionary raw land, rich in resources, strategically invaluable, and ripe for conquest. He also understood something the Senate complacent and blind could not fathom. Gaul, if united under a strong leader hostile to Rome, would pose a catastrophic threat. Caesar's calculations were equal parts strategy and destiny. He would protect Rome, yes, but he would also reshape it. Through war, he would build power. Through victory, he would build loyalty. Through conquest, he would build a legacy that made even Pompey's Eastern victories seem like footnotes. And so, with a small but seasoned army, Caesar stepped into a world that would soon tremble beneath the march of Roman legions. The beginning of the Gallic campaign, Caesar looks beyond the horizon. The spark that ignited Caesar's war in Gaul came swiftly. A massive migration of the Helvetici. A powerful Gallic tribe threatened to pass through Roman territory as they searched for new land. This movement, involving hundreds of thousands of people, was not simply a migration. It was a geopolitical earthquake. If allowed to continue, it would destabilize the entire frontier and encourage other tribes to follow. Caesar seized the moment with the decisiveness that defined his character. He denied their request, fortified the Rhone River with lightning-fast construction, and positioned himself as the defender of Roman stability. But he understood that more was at stake. The Helvetii crisis gave him a perfect justification to launch a large-scale military campaign. And once the Senate received reports describing the threat, they reluctantly supported his actions. In truth, Caesar had already begun shaping the narrative that would make him indispensable. The Helvetii conflict marked the first of many battles in which Caesar demonstrated unmatched tactical brilliance. He defeated them through relentless pursuit and superior maneuvering, driving them across rivers, through forests, and into a decisive confrontation. When the Helvetii were finally forced to surrender, Caesar documented the victory with the precision of a historian and the pride of a master strategist. His commentary De Bello Gallico, though written years later, immortalized these events and crafted an image of Caesar as Rome's lone hero, standing against the chaos of the barbarian frontier. The campaign against the Helvetii, however, was only the beginning. Caesar's victory awakened interest and fear among the tribes of Gaul. Some sought alliance, others plotted resistance. And lurking in the shadows was the man who would one day become Caesar's greatest Gallic opponent, Vercingetorix. But for now, Rome advanced, and Gaul watched in uncertainty. Caesar expands the borders. From defensive guardian to unstoppable conqueror. Following his initial victories, Caesar moved deeper into Gaul, with purpose sharpened by political necessity. He knew that the Senate back in Rome was divided about his growing popularity. Some saw him as a hero, others saw him as a threat. To secure his future, Caesar needed more than respect. He needed overwhelming success, and so he engaged tribe after tribe, transforming isolated skirmishes into sweeping campaigns. When the Germanic king, Ariovistus, crossed into Gaul and threatened Roman allies, Caesar faced him in a confrontation that would echo across Europe. Ariovistus was a formidable leader, brutal cunning, and commanding a fierce army. The Senate had attempted diplomacy with him and failed. Caesar offered battle. The clash was fierce, psychological, and momentous. At one point, Caesar's troops nearly broke under the ferocity of Germanic warriors, known for fighting with wild, terrifying cries. But Caesar rallied them personally, riding into the thick of combat. Victory came, and with it, the removal of a major threat. More importantly, Caesar cemented his reputation as the only Roman capable of defeating not only Gauls, but also the Germanic tribes whose ferocity had haunted Roman nightmares for generations. With each triumph, Caesar expanded Rome's borders further north and west. He subdued the Belgae, one of the most warlike coalitions in Gaul, He crushed resistance in Aquitania. He built bridges over raging rivers, not because he needed to cross, but because he wanted to send a message. No natural barrier, no enemy, no distance could impede the will of Rome. One of the most symbolic of these acts was his decision to cross the Rhine River, entering Germanic territory in a display of unmatched engineering and military power. His army built a massive wooden bridge in just 10 days, a feat that astounded enemies and terrified rivals. Caesar crossed, surveyed the land, made his point, and withdrew. It was psychological warfare at its finest. He wanted the Germans to know Rome could strike anywhere at any time. Caesar's conquest also reached across the sea. In 55 BCE, he launched the first Roman expedition to Britain. Though the campaigns there were limited and did not result in permanent control, they expanded Roman awareness of the island and added to the mythos surrounding Caesar's ambition. Each victory, each crossing, each construction project became another tile in the mosaic of Caesar's rising legend. By now, Caesar had evolved from a clever politician into a transformative military force. His letters and commentaries sent back to Rome shaped public perception with masterful precision. He described himself as a protector of Rome, a visionary leader expanding the Republic's glory, and a commander capable of bringing civilization to the farthest corners of the world. Yet beneath the rhetoric, something deeper was happening. Caesar was building an army fiercely loyal to him, not to the Senate, not to the Republic, but to him personally. These soldiers marched with him through rain, mud, snow, and slaughter. They saw him brave every danger they faced. They witnessed his strategic brilliance, his compassion toward wounded troops, his relentless pursuit of victory. Caesar's legions became an extension of his will, disciplined, devoted, and unbreakable. Meanwhile, Rome itself began to change. Wealth from Gaul poured into Caesar's coffers. His growing popularity terrified the aristocrats. Pompey, once his ally, began to fear his influence, and Crassus, the third pillar of their alliance, would soon be lost in the disastrous campaign at Carrhae, an event that shattered the triumvirate's balance. Caesar's Gallic conquests sent tremors through the Republic. He was no longer the rising star. He was becoming the sun. By the end of his initial campaigns, Caesar had done what no Roman had ever achieved. He brought nearly the entire region of Gaul under Roman control. He redrew borders, placed loyal chieftains in power, took hostages as guarantees of peace, and stationed legions throughout key strongholds. Roman influence spread rapidly. Some tribes cooperated, seeing economic and political advantages. Others simmered with resentment, recognizing too late that Caesar's protection was a veil for Roman domination. The peace Caesar established was uneasy, fragile, and destined to shatter. For in the heart of Gaul, resistance was gathering. A new leader was rising, charismatic, noble, and fiercely determined to unite Gaul against Rome. Caesar's greatest challenge and Gaul's greatest rebellion was on the horizon. But that is a story for the next section. By the early 50s, BCE, Julius Caesar had carved an empire out of Gaul. Tribe after tribe had fallen under Roman control, their leaders forced to swear loyalty, their lands reorganized, their sons held as hostages to guarantee peace. From the outside, it looked as though Gaul had been fully subdued. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered like a dormant volcano. The tribes remembered the freedoms they once enjoyed. They remembered their ancestral pride, their independence, their warrior traditions. They knew Rome did not come as a guest, it came as a master, and all they needed was a spark to ignite a rebellion that would shake the Roman world. That spark came in the form of a young Arvernian nobleman named Vercingetorix. He was charismatic, fiercely intelligent, and commanding in presence. Unlike many Gallic chiefs who had fought Caesar in scattered factions, Vercingetorix possessed something far more valuable than courage. He possessed vision. He understood that Gaul could not defeat Rome tribe by tribe. It needed unity. It needed discipline. It needed a leader who could rise above local rivalries and forge a common purpose. And so, with a mix of persuasion force and destiny, Vercingetorix united the tribes of Gaul into one great confederation. Caesar had conquered Gaul, but now Gaul had found its Caesar. Vercingetorix's strategy was brutally effective. He knew his people could not match Rome in open battle. So he adopted scorched earth tactics, burning fields, destroying villages, cutting off Caesar's supplies, and avoiding direct confrontation. The Gallic countryside became a wasteland by design. Roman soldiers marched through empty fields, starving villages, and blackened ruins. Food became scarce. Morale dipped. For the first time in Gaul, Caesar found himself reacting rather than acting. And when Vercingetorix finally engaged him directly, it was on his terms. Caesar, the man who had mastered Gaul, had finally met his true equal. The campaign between Caesar and Vercingetorix unfolded like a clash between two grandmasters, each trying to outmaneuver the other. Vercingetorix avoided large-scale battle while ambushing Roman foraging parties and harassing Caesar's supply lines. He struck quickly, retreated swiftly, and left chaos behind him. Caesar's legions, though experienced and disciplined, struggled against this war of attrition. They were built for decisive engagements, not for chasing shadows across a vast and hostile land. But Caesar was relentless. He pursued Vercingetorix through torrential rains, across treacherous terrain, and into fortified towns. At the Battle of Gergovia, Caesar even suffered one of the rare defeats of his career. It was a devastating blow. Morale plummeted, allies defected, and critics in Rome began whispering that Caesar's luck had finally run out. Vercingetorix, sensing momentum, pressed harder. The rebellion expanded as more tribes joined the cause. But Caesar did not break. He gathered reinforcements, tightened discipline, and began to predict Vercingetorix's moves with uncanny precision. Every setback became fuel for his determination. Every defeat sharpened his resolve. And eventually, the chase drove both armies to a hilltop fortress that would become immortal Alesia. Alesia, perched on a steep hill and surrounded by rivers and natural defenses, was one of the most formidable strongholds in Gaul. When Vercingetorix retreated into it, with roughly 80,000 warriors, he believed he could hold out long enough for reinforcements to gather from across the land. In his mind, Alesia would become the beating heart of Gallic resistance. For Caesar, however, it was an opportunity, a chance to trap the rebel king and force a decisive confrontation. But to do so required a feat of engineering so impossible that even Caesar's officers hesitated when he proposed it. Caesar intended to surround Alesia not with an army, but with walls, 2 walls, 40 kilometers of fortifications in total. One wall facing inward to keep Vercingetorix contained. One wall facing outward to defend against the inevitable arrival of a massive Gallic relief army. At no point in ancient history had anything of this scale been attempted. It was as if Caesar intended to trap the sky itself. The construction began immediately. Under threats of ambush and with limited supplies, Caesar's legions built trenches, palisades, ditches, towers, spikes, and hidden traps, defensive layers so intricate that modern historians remain in awe. They constructed canals to divert rivers. They built deep pits lined with sharpened stakes. They created a deadly labyrinth around the entire fortress. All this while an angry army of 80,000 Gauls watched from the hilltop, waiting for the Romans to falter. They never did. Caesar's legions were unmatched in discipline. They worked day and night, enduring hunger, exhaustion, and constant attacks. And when the double wall system was finally completed, Alesia and the fate of Gaul was sealed. But Vercingetorix had counted on reinforcements, and reinforcements came, and they did not come quietly. Estimates vary, but ancient sources describe numbers ranging from 200,000 to 250,000 warriors, perhaps exaggerated, but certainly representing the largest Gallic army ever assembled. The hills around Alesia erupted with the sound of war horns. Torches lit the night like a second sky. For the Romans encircled between two enemy forces, it was a moment of pure terror. Caesar himself described the sight as overwhelming. On one side, Vercingetorix and his trapped army prepared to break out. On the other, the massive relief force prepared to break in. And in the middle stood Caesar calm, calculating, and ready to command the greatest defensive battle of his life. The assault began with thunderous intensity. Waves of Gallic warriors smashed against the outer Roman fortifications. Arrows filled the air, siege ladders were raised, Roman towers shook under the pressure. Caesar's men fought with grim determination, shifting between walls as needed. Trumpets blared. Officers shouted orders. Blood soaked the trenches. At the same time, Vercingetorix launched coordinated attacks from inside the fortress, creating a nightmare scenario for the Romans who were forced to defend in two opposite directions. Caesar rode along the lines, encouraging his men, reinforcing weak points, and throwing reserves into the fiercest fighting. Several times the Romans nearly collapsed. Several times the Gauls nearly broke through. But Caesar's discipline held like iron. The turning point came when the relief army launched an enormous assault on a weakly defended section of the Roman line. The Romans, outnumbered, were pushed back. Panic spread. Defeat hung in the air. Caesar personally gathered his Germanic cavalry, redeployed cohorts from the interior wall, and led a counterattack that became the stuff of legend. Riding with his face uncovered so his soldiers could see him, he plunged into the melee. His presence ignited the legions with a surge of ferocity. The Romans pushed forward, broke the Gallic assault, and turned the tide. When the relief army saw their best chance slip away, their morale shattered. They began to retreat slowly at first, then in chaos. Vercingetorix, watching from the fortress, witnessed the hope of Gaul collapsing before him. With supplies dwindling and no reinforcements left, he made a decision that would echo through history. The morning after the final battle, Vercingetorix summoned his council. He told them that he would give himself up to save his people from slaughter. And so he rode out of Alesia in full armor, mounted on a magnificent horse, and approached Caesar's camp. Before the Roman general, he dismounted, removed his weapons, and knelt. It was a moment heavy with tragedy, dignity, and destiny. Caesar had defeated the only man in Gaul capable of matching him. The image of Vercingetorix kneeling would become one of history's most iconic scenes: the fall of a king, the rise of a legend. With the fall of Alesia, the Gallic War was effectively over. The tribes surrendered one by one. Gaul became part of the Roman world. Caesar's fame exploded beyond anything Rome had ever seen. He was no longer merely a general, he was a military god. Alesia was hailed as one of the greatest sieges in history, a masterpiece of engineering strategy, discipline, and endurance. Caesar's political power swelled. His enemies trembled. And the Senate, already fearful, realized that Gaul had not only made Caesar rich and powerful, it had made him unstoppable. When Julius Caesar returned from Gaul, he did not return as a mere governor, nor even as a celebrated general. He returned as the most famous man in the Roman world. His victories had stunned Europe, reshaped the map, and filled Rome with unprecedented wealth. Tribes that had once threatened the Republic were now crushed. New provinces had been added to Rome's domain. Gold poured into the treasury, and the people, those masses who had long suffered under the corruption of aristocrats, worshipped Caesar as their champion. Statues were raised, songs were composed, children played games pretending to be Caesar defeating the Gauls. His name became synonymous with destiny. But fame is a double-edged sword, and in Rome it was deadly. The more the Roman people adored Caesar, the more the Senate trembled. And Pompey Magnus, once Caesar's closest ally, now the most powerful man in Rome, felt the tremor most of all. Pompey had been the golden son of the Republic long before Caesar rose to prominence. He had beaten pirates, conquered the East, expanded Roman influence across 3 continents, and saved the Republic more than once. For years he had stood unmatched until Caesar stepped into the spotlight with victories so spectacular that Pompey's own glory seemed to dim beside them. At first, Pompey denied feeling threatened. He said publicly that Caesar was like a son, like a protege. But Rome whispered, senators whispered, rivals whispered, and those whispers changed everything. Caesar is becoming too powerful. Caesar has the loyalty of the army. Caesar will return and seize Rome itself. As Caesar's popularity soared, Pompey's fears, fed by schemers, aristocrats, and enemies of the triumvirate, began to harden into conviction. The alliance that had once ruled Rome now strained under rivalry, pride, and suspicion. The death of Julius Caesar's daughter and Pompey's beloved wife tore away the last personal bond that held the two men together. Julia had been the emotional bridge between them, softening Pompey's pride and moderating Caesar's ambition. But when she died in childbirth, that bridge collapsed. And soon after, Crassus, the third pillar of the triumvirate, died in Parthia, leaving only 2 men standing. Rome was now too small for the both of them. The balance of power was shattered, and into this void stepped the Senate, eager, fearful, and ready to turn Pompey against Caesar. As Caesar's victories in Gaul reached Rome, so too did reports of his charisma, his generosity to soldiers, and his political genius. He paid his men well. He shared spoils with them. He called them comrades rather than subordinates. They would follow him into fire. The Senate understood what that meant. Caesar had something far more dangerous than wealth. He had loyalty. And not just any loyalty, but the loyalty of legions hardened by a decade of brutal war. Those soldiers owed everything to Caesar, their fortunes, their glory, their survival. No man in Rome commanded such devotion. The Senate, dominated by conservative aristocrats known as the Optimates, saw Caesar as a threat to the Republic's very existence. They did not fear what he had done. They feared what he could do. So they began to pressure Pompey, the only man with comparable authority to protect Rome from Caesar. They flattered him. They warned him. They poisoned him with half-truths. Slowly, Pompey allowed himself to believe that he alone stood between the Republic and tyranny. Caesar knew the Senate feared him, but he believed Pompey could still be reasoned with. Yet Pompey, now swayed by the Optimates and encouraged by his own pride, took command of Rome as sole consul, a move that alarmed Caesar deeply. And then, in 50 BCE, the Senate issued the decree that changed everything. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a political death sentence. Without his legions, Caesar would be open to prosecution, exile, or assassination. His enemies would see to that. His decade in Gaul would mean nothing. His victories, his conquests, his loyalty to Rome, forgotten in an instant. Caesar offered compromise after compromise. He was willing to step down if Pompey did the same. He was willing to give up his command if he could run for consul in absentia. He even offered to surrender all but one legion. But the Senate, driven by fear and hatred, refused every proposal. They wanted Caesar stripped of power or dead. The ultimatum came in the cold of January 49th BCE. The Senate, with Pompey's backing, passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree declaring Caesar an enemy of the state unless he disarmed immediately. It was the same decree once used against Catiline the traitor. To be labeled under it was to be condemned. Caesar's choice was stark surrender and die politically, or march and risk plunging Rome into civil war. Caesar gathered his officers. He weighed the cost. He considered the blood that might be spilled, and then he uttered the words that would echo through history: Alea iacta est. The die is cast. The night was bitterly cold along the northern frontier of Italy, and the small river, called the Rubicon, humble, narrow, barely more than a stream, glimmered under the winter moon. It was a river that most Romans would never think twice about. A river that farmers crossed easily, that travelers overlooked, that merchants ignored. Yet, in the Roman political order, the Rubicon was not just a line on the map. It was the sacred boundary separating a Roman province from Italy itself. For any general to cross it with armed troops was treason, an act punishable by death, an offense that declared war against the Senate and the people of Rome. And so it was here, on the banks of this quiet river, that Julius Caesar paused, knowing that the next step he took would plunge the Republic into a conflict it could never escape. Behind him lay Gaul, the land he had conquered through 10 years of fire and steel. Ahead of him lay Italy, Pompey, the Senate, and the fate of the Roman world. Caesar's officers waited for his command in tense silence. They knew what crossing the Rubicon meant. They knew that once their sandals touched the southern bank, once the eagles of their legions entered Italy, every man among them would be branded a traitor by the Senate. They could not go back. They could not undo what would follow. Caesar himself understood better than anyone the enormity of this decision. He had fought civil wars in distant lands, seen tribes rise and fall, watched kings kneel before him. But this was different. This was Rome. This was home. And by crossing this river, he risked destroying the very republic he had served. He risked plunging his country into years of bloodshed and chaos. But he also knew the alternative. If he returned to Rome without his army, he would be arrested, humiliated, prosecuted, perhaps even killed. His enemies in the Senate would never let him rise again. They feared him too deeply, hated him too fiercely. And so Caesar stood on the edge of the Rubicon, torn between duty and survival, between loyalty and ambition, between the republic he loved and the future he believed only he could shape. According to ancient writers, Caesar hesitated, reflecting on the catastrophe that might follow. Then, with a sudden burst of resolve, he spoke the words that would echo across millennia: Alea iacta est. The die is cast. With those words, simple, calm, chilling Caesar crossed the Rubicon. His horse stepped forward. His officers followed. The legions marched, and history changed its course forever. The news reached Rome like a thunderclap. Caesar has crossed into Italy with his legions. Panic erupted instantly. Senators fled the city in disbelief, rushing toward Pompey's camp. Shops closed. Temples locked their doors. The streets filled with frightened whispers. For decades, Rome had avoided true civil war. Political violence, yes. Street gangs, yes. Corruption and assassinations, yes. But full-scale civil war, Roman against Roman legion against legion, was a nightmare many hoped never to see again. Yet now, that nightmare had become real. Pompey the Great, convinced that Caesar would never dare such an audacious act, suddenly found himself unprepared. His forces were scattered across the provinces. His loyal senators clamored for a response. And Pompey, forced into a defensive stance, made the fateful choice to abandon Rome itself. "I will raise forces in the east," he declared, retreating south to regroup. For the first time in centuries, Rome, proud, eternal, invincible, lay undefended. Caesar entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator in his own eyes. He believed he was preserving the rights of the Roman people, standing against a corrupt Senate that had twisted the Republic into an instrument of aristocratic control. But even as he marched through the streets, welcomed by cheering crowds, Caesar knew the war had only begun. Pompey would return, his enemies would rally, and Rome would drown in blood before the question was settled. Who would rule, Caesar or the Senate? Caesar acted swiftly. He seized the treasury, securing the funds needed to wage war. He addressed the people, promising that he sought not tyranny, but justice. Then he left Rome almost as quickly as he had entered it. Pompey was gathering forces in Greece. Caesar could not afford delay. The Republic had split into two camps, and every province, every legion, every governor now faced a choice that would echo across their lives, Caesar or Pompey. What made this civil war horrifying was not just its scale, but its nature. This was not Roman against barbarian. This was Roman against Roman men who had once served together, fought together, bled together. Families were divided. Senators turned against each other. Old friendships shattered. Pompey commanded the support of the majority of the Senate, along with Rome's wealthiest nobles. He had the backing of the East veteran legion's deep coffers, naval superiority. Caesar commanded the loyalty of hardened veterans from Gaul, men who trusted him with their lives and believed he was destined to rule. It was a conflict of ideologies as much as armies. Pompey's supporters claimed they fought for the Republic's freedom. Caesar's followers insisted they fought against corruption and oligarchy. Both sides believed the future of Rome depended on their victory. Caesar moved with astonishing speed. In one campaign after another, he swept through Italy, Spain, and North Africa, seizing strategic points before Pompey could react. His energy was relentless. His troops marched faster than any army in Europe. His name became a force of nature, terrifying to his enemies, electrifying to his allies. But the decisive confrontation loomed. It would take place not in Rome, but across the sea in Greece. Pompey, now commanding a vast army reinforced by senators, kings, and eastern allies, awaited Caesar near the plains of Pharsalus. Before he sailed to face Pompey, Caesar addressed his troops. He reminded them of Gaul, of their victories, of the bond they shared. "We have conquered the world before," he told them. "Now we must conquer Rome itself." The men roared in response. They did not see themselves as traitors. They saw themselves as the defenders of Caesar's vision, a vision of a Rome stronger, fairer, and unified under one leader. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he unleashed forces that no one, not even he, could control. The civil war tore through the Republic like wildfire. Cities changed hands. Governors betrayed oaths. Legions clashed in battles of staggering brutality. Pharsalus, Dyrrhachium, Thapsus Munda. Thousands died. Rome herself was transformed, her soul dragged through fear, loyalty, ambition, and violence. Caesar won again and again, proving his tactical genius. Pompey, once the greatest general of Rome, fled Egypt, where he was murdered by those hoping to earn Caesar's favor. And when Caesar wept at the sight of Pompey's severed head, he understood the true cost of crossing the Rubicon. This war was not glory, it was tragedy. It consumed friend and foe alike. Yet without that single step across a quiet river, Caesar believed Rome would have fallen into oligarchic tyranny. He believed the Senate had lost its way, that only decisive action could save the Republic from rotting from within. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps he was wrong. History still argues. But what is undeniable is that Caesar's choice at the Rubicon reshaped not only Rome, but the entire Western world. It ended the Republic. It created the empire. It paved the way for emperors, for centuries of Roman dominance, for the Pax Romana, for the world as we know it today. The Rubicon was shallow, but its consequences were deep. By the time Julius Caesar marched toward Greece in pursuit of Pompey the Great, the Roman Republic had already begun to fracture under the weight of their rivalry. Years earlier, the two men had been partners, brothers in arms, within the first triumvirate, united by political ambition and personal alliances. Pompey had married Caesar's beloved daughter Julia. Their families had dined together, celebrated victories together, and shaped Rome together. But Julia's death severed the human bond between them. Crassus's death at Carrhae shattered the political triangle that kept the Republic balanced. And the rise of Caesar's power in Gaul and Rome, in every corner of the Republic, turned Pompey from friend into enemy. He feared Caesar. He envied him. He believed Rome was not big enough for two giants. And so as civil war swept across the Republic, the world watched in awe and dread as the two greatest Romans of their age marched toward a confrontation that seemed inevitable from the moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Pompey, now backed by the Senate, assembled a vast army in Greece, legions drawn from the East cavalry from the kings of the Hellenistic world, and financial support from the wealthiest nobles of Rome. His camps bustled with activity, filled with senators who still believed Pompey represented the last hope of the Republic. Pompey himself radiated confidence. He had once cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, conquered vast territories in Asia, and returned to Rome as the most celebrated general of his era. How could a younger upstart like Caesar defeat him? Caesar, meanwhile, arrived with fewer troops, battle-hardened, loyal, fearless, but drastically outnumbered. Caesar understood that this would be the defining battle of his life. Pompey commanded the Senate, the aristocracy, and the official apparatus of Rome. Caesar commanded the hearts of soldiers who had followed him through snow swamps and slaughter. This was more than a civil war. It was a test of destiny. Before the decisive battle at Pharsalus, Caesar and Pompey played a deadly game of strategy across Greece. Caesar, short on supplies and reinforcements, tried repeatedly to force Pompey into battle. Pompey refused. With superior numbers and naval dominance, he believed he could starve Caesar into surrender. Caesar's situation grew desperate. His men went without grain-eating roots and wild plants. His cavalry was so depleted that he sometimes used German auxiliary horsemen to mask the shortage. Yet Caesar never lost the confidence of his troops. He ate with them, marched with them, worked beside them, reminding them constantly of their shared victories. He understood morale, and he knew that soldiers who believed in their commander could overcome impossible odds. Pompey, in contrast, faced pressure from senators in his camp. They mocked him, saying he feared Caesar. They insisted that Pompey attack crush Caesar and return to Rome as the Republic's savior. Pompey, though cautious by nature, eventually yielded. When Caesar maneuvered near the plains of Pharsalus, a wide-open field ideally suited for Pompey's superior cavalry, Pompey finally agreed to battle. His strategy was elegant. He would use his massive cavalry wing to destroy Caesar's right flank, envelop the enemy, and end the war in a single, sweeping blow. It was a strategy that had defeated countless foes in the East. It was a strategy that made perfect sense against a smaller army. It was also a strategy that Caesar quietly anticipated. On the morning of August 9th, 48 BCE, the sun rose over Pharsalus to reveal the largest and most decisive battle of the Roman Civil War. Pompey's forces were formidable, approximately 45,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and a mass of auxiliary troops. Caesar had barely 22,000 infantry and a meager 1,000 cavalry. The imbalance was staggering. Ancient historians say Pompey's lines shimmered with polished armor, bright banners, and the confidence of the aristocratic elite. Caesar's legions, hardened by years of brutal warfare in Gaul, stood in battered armor, their shields dented, their tunics worn, but their eyes sharp, disciplined, unwavering. Caesar rode along the front, speaking softly to his men, reminding them of their victories, their loyalty, their bond. Pompey addressed his troops from a distance, formal, dignified, statesman-like, a general who commanded respect, but not the same fierce devotion Caesar inspired. The battle began with a shock. Pompey ordered his infantry to stand still and receive Caesar's charge, an unusual tactic meant to exhaust Caesar's troops. But Caesar, reading Pompey's intention, instantly told his men to halt midway, regain breath, realign their ranks, and then renew the charge. Pompey's infantry faltered at the unexpected pause. But the real storm came from Pompey's left wing, his cavalry thundering across the field to smash Caesar's right flank. This was the moment Pompey believed would win the war. Yet Caesar had planned for it. He had hidden a fourth line of reserve infantry behind his cavalrymen, trained specifically to fight horsemen. As Pompey's cavalry collided with Caesar's line, the reserve troops rushed forward, thrusting their short swords at the faces of Pompey's mounted fighters. Horses panicked, riders fell, and in minutes, Pompey's greatest advantage evaporated. With Pompey's cavalry shattered, Caesar gave the final, devastating command, advance. His legions surged forward like a steel tide. Pompey's infantry broke under the pressure. Panic rippled through their lines. Senators fled. The proud army that believed it could starve Caesar into submission now found itself crushed beneath the weight of Caesar's experience, discipline, and tactical genius. Pharsalus became chaos. Pompey watched in horror as his formation collapsed. He had lost. The war was not over, but the dream of defeating Caesar had died in the dust of the battlefield. Pompey fled the battlefield in despair, abandoning his men and riding toward the coast. He boarded a ship bound for Egypt, a kingdom he had once supported, believing he would find refuge among allies. But Egypt's court was unstable, ruled by the young pharaoh Ptolemy the and his advisors. They saw Pompey not as a potential ally, but as a dangerous burden. They feared Caesar. They feared being on the wrong side of history. And so, in one of the most infamous betrayals of the ancient world, they decided to kill Pompey to win Caesar's favor. On September 28th, 48 BCE, as Pompey stepped into a small boat approaching the Egyptian shore, he was stabbed to death by assassins sent by the pharaoh. The once great general, the man who had commanded Rome, subdued pirates, conquered the East, died quietly unarmed and abandoned. His severed head was presented to Caesar when he arrived in Alexandria. Caesar, upon seeing the head of his former friend, mentor, and rival, did something unexpected. He wept. He refused the gift. He ordered Pompey's assassins executed. For all their rivalry, Pompey had once been family. He had been a pillar of Rome. And Caesar, in that moment, mourned not the death of an enemy, but the death of a chapter in Roman history. With Pompey dead, Caesar emerged as the undisputed ruler of Rome. The war continued in scattered pockets, but no rival remained with Pompey's stature or legitimacy. Caesar had achieved the unthinkable, defeating a larger army commanded by Rome's most respected general. He had won not by luck, but by genius. He had secured his path to dictatorship, and Rome itself, stunned by the sudden shift in power, awaited what Caesar would do next. The victory at Pharsalus was not just a military triumph. It was a turning point for the Republic, a moment when the fate of Rome bent decisively toward empire. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of Pompey, he expected a swift diplomatic encounter and a return to Rome. Instead, he stepped into one of the most explosive royal crises of the ancient world. Egypt, rich with ancient prestige and wealth, was ruled not by a unified monarch, but by two feuding siblings, Ptolemy the Thirteen, a teenage king manipulated by ambitious advisors, and Cleopatra VII, the brilliant, charismatic queen who had been forced into exile. Their rivalry threatened to tear Egypt apart, undermining the very stability Rome relied upon. Caesar saw the turmoil immediately. He recognized both the danger and the opportunity. Egypt was vital. Its grain fed half of Rome. Its ports commanded essential trade routes, and its throne was a hinge on which regional politics turned. If Caesar controlled Egypt, he controlled the Mediterranean's beating heart. While Ptolemy's advisors tried to flatter Caesar with feasts, gifts, and political theater, Cleopatra planned a far bolder move. Knowing that Caesar valued intelligence as much as diplomacy, and that he despised weakness, she resolved to bypass the pharaoh's court entirely. In one of the most iconic moments in ancient history, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Caesar's private quarters, wrapped inside a carpet or bedroll, depending on the historian. When the bundle was unrolled, Cleopatra emerged not as a desperate exile, but as a queen reclaiming her destiny. The moment captivated Caesar. Here was a woman, unlike any he had met, educated in philosophy, mathematics, politics, and languages, trained in royal power since childhood, and possessing a charisma that cut through the formalities of diplomacy like a blade. Cleopatra spoke to Caesar as an equal, something few in Rome or Egypt dared. She argued her case not as a supplicant, but as a partner. Caesar, hardened by war and politics, recognized a mind as sharp as his own. Their alliance was born that night political at first, but soon something far more intimate. The union between Caesar and Cleopatra was not simply a romance. It was a meeting of two worlds: Rome at the height of its ambition, and Egypt in the twilight of its ancient glory. Cleopatra understood that aligning with Caesar was her path back to the throne. Caesar understood that supporting Cleopatra allowed him to shape Egypt's future and secure Rome's influence. Yet beneath the strategy pulsed a magnetic attraction, an undeniable chemistry that ancient writers have struggled to fully capture. Cleopatra became the most formidable woman Caesar had ever encountered, and Caesar became the powerful ally Cleopatra needed to reclaim her crown. Together, they would reshape not only Egypt, but the Mediterranean political landscape. Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra ignited an immediate crisis. Ptolemy the Thirteen and his advisors were outraged. They saw Caesar's involvement as interference proof that Rome intended to use Egypt as a pawn. Civil war exploded in Alexandria's streets. The royal court, fractured soldiers clashed in the palace district, and the once great city became a battleground. Caesar found himself in the center of a conflict far larger than he had anticipated. Rather than withdraw, he entrenched himself. He declared that both siblings must honor the will of their late father, who had named Cleopatra and Ptolemy co-rulers. Ptolemy's faction refused. They attempted to besiege Caesar, trapping him in Alexandria with a small Roman force and cutting off communication to the outside world. The Alexandrian War had begun. Caesar, vastly outnumbered, relied on rapid maneuvers, naval engagements, and the use of Alexandria's narrow streets to offset the enemy's advantage. The fighting was vicious, often chaotic. Ancient historians describe fires raging through the harbor district flames that may have damaged part of the famed Library of Alexandria. Caesar, however, refused to retreat. He had fought on the fields of Gaul, crossed oceans, and defeated Rome's greatest general. He would not be defeated in a foreign palace by teenage monarchs and scheming courtiers. Reinforcements eventually arrived, legions from Asia Minor under Mithridates of Pergamum. The war's momentum shifted. Caesar led a counterattack, crushing Ptolemy's forces near the Nile. During the chaos of battle, Ptolemy XIII reportedly drowned while attempting to flee by boat. With her brother dead and the rebellion defeated, Cleopatra was restored to the throne. She would now rule Egypt with Caesar's blessing as its most powerful monarch since the height of the Ptolemaic dynasty. With the war over, Caesar remained in Egypt for several months. His presence was political, but also deeply personal. He and Cleopatra lived together in the royal palace, sailed the Nile on grand expeditions, and spoke for hours about power empires and the future. Cleopatra was pregnant with his child, and while Rome whispered scandals, Caesar seemed unconcerned. He admired strength, audacity, brilliance, and Cleopatra embodied all three. She was not a submissive lover or a political puppet. She was a queen confident and commanding who matched Caesar not only in ambition, but in vision. In June 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV, Philomedor Caesar, known to history as Caesarion Little Caesar. To Egyptians, he was the heir to the god-king pharaohs. To Romans, he represented a dangerous possibility, the creation of a dynasty that blended Roman and Hellenistic bloodlines. Caesar never publicly acknowledged Caesarion as his son. Roman politics made the claim too dangerous, yet Cleopatra asserted it proudly. For her, Caesarion symbolized the union of two civilizations. For Caesar, the child may have represented a legacy beyond Rome. And for the world around them, the birth of Caesarion sent shockwaves through courts and senates across the Mediterranean. As political alliances strengthened and personal ties deepened, Caesar prepared to leave Egypt. He had more wars to fight, more enemies to defeat, and a Rome in chaos awaiting his return. Before departing, he installed Cleopatra as ruler, together with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, another symbolic co-regency that left Cleopatra firmly in power. Caesar ensured Egypt would be loyal to him, stable under her leadership, and indebted to Rome. Cleopatra, in turn, ensured that Caesar's influence would extend into Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. Their parting was bittersweet but strategic. Cleopatra would visit Rome later, living in Caesar's villa across the Tiber. Caesar would carry memories of Alexandria, the palaces, the philosophy, the queen, back to a Rome soon to be reshaped by his hand. Their destinies, though tied, were also diverging. Caesar moved toward dictatorship. Cleopatra moved toward a reign that would make her the last great pharaoh of Egypt. And Caesarion, their son, became a symbol of what might have been a fusion of Roman authority and Egyptian divine kingship. The encounter between Caesar and Cleopatra was more than a romantic episode. It was a turning point in ancient geopolitics. Caesar left Egypt not just victorious, but transformed. Cleopatra remained on the throne, not just restored, but empowered. And history itself had been altered by their convergence, two rulers whose ambitions intertwined for a brief, incandescent moment before fate sent them down separate but equally legendary paths. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome after years of civil war and a whirlwind campaign in Egypt, he found not only a fractured political system, but an everyday life thrown into chaos. Even the Roman calendar, once a source of civic order, had become hopelessly misaligned with the seasons. Festivals were drifting into the wrong months. Elections were manipulated by priests who extended or shortened years to benefit political allies, and farmers struggled to plan harvests. Rome, the so-called center of the civilized world, couldn't even measure time properly. Caesar understood that an empire, or the empire he intended to build, required precision, predictability, and stability. So, he took on a task no Roman had dared to attempt. He would reconstruct time itself. Working with the Alexandrian astronomer Julius Caesar, designed a calendar based on the solar year rather than the lunar cycles that had caused so much confusion. The new system was elegant in its simplicity. 365 days divided into 12 months, with a leap day added every fourth year. It was rational, scientific, and clear, a calendar fit for the world's rising superpower. In the year 46 BCE, Caesar enacted the reform. To realign the seasons, he declared that year to be 445 days long, and Annus Confusionis, the year of confusion. But afterward, everything snapped into place. Festivals returned to their proper seasons, agricultural planning stabilized, and political manipulation of the calendar became impossible. The Julian calendar was so effective that it became the foundation of Western timekeeping for more than 600 years. Today, the Gregorian calendar we use is only a minor refinement of Caesar's work. Through this single reform, Caesar altered not just Rome, but the rhythm of human civilization. Caesar knew that if Rome was to survive, it needed more than military victories or symbolic gestures. It needed structural renewal, practical reforms that would make life more stable for ordinary citizens and reassert the state's authority across a sprawling republic. One of his most ambitious changes targeted taxation. For generations, Roman tax collection had been dominated by publicani private contractors who bought tax rights from the state and exploited provinces for profit. These tax farmers became infamous for corruption, extortion, and brutality. They enriched themselves by crushing local populations, creating resentment that fueled rebellions and made Roman rule seem oppressive. Caesar dismantled the system. In its place, he introduced a more direct method of taxation administered by local governments under Roman oversight. The reform slashed corruption, stabilized provincial economies, and restored a measure of justice to communities long abused by Rome's greedier agents. This focus on provincial administration extended into broader changes in local governance. Caesar appointed competent governors, often loyalists, but men known for efficiency rather than aristocratic privilege. He required regular reports, imposed strict limitations on provincial abuse, and held officials accountable for misconduct. For the first time in generations, many regions of the Republic experienced a sense of predictable governance rather than the arbitrary rule of opportunistic nobles. Caesar's political genius was not simply his ability to seize power, but his understanding that power must deliver tangible improvements. By reforming provincial administration, he laid the foundations for the more centralized, efficient imperial system that Augustus would later perfect. One of Caesar's most remarkable and controversial traits was his policy of clementia, or mercy. Unlike Sulla, who had purged Rome with executions and proscriptions, Caesar rejected the politics of terror. After the Civil War, he chose forgiveness. Senators who had fought against him were welcomed back into political life. Pompeians were restored to their estates. Even some of his harshest critics were treated with respect. This policy won him admiration among the masses, who saw him as a generous victor rather than a tyrant. But among Rome's old aristocracy, it sparked unease. Many believed his mercy was strategic, a way to bind enemies in chains of gratitude, turning rivals into dependents. To men raised in a culture of vengeance and rigid honor, Caesar's forgiveness seemed unnatural, almost manipulative. Some feared it was a mask hiding an ambition far greater than dictatorship. At the same time, Caesar expanded the rights of non-Romans on an unprecedented scale. He granted citizenship to entire communities in Gaul and Spain, integrating provincial elites into Rome's political fabric. For centuries, citizenship had been a jealously guarded privilege of Italians. Caesar tore down that barrier. He understood that a larger, more diverse Rome would be a stronger Rome. By welcoming outsiders into the Republic, he set the stage for an empire of many peoples, rather than a narrow Italian oligarchy. But the old guard viewed this policy with suspicion and resentment. They saw their exclusive status slipping away, their influence diluted by newcomers who owed loyalty not to the Senate but to Caesar himself. In trying to unite Rome's territories, Caesar inadvertently deepened the divide between the Senate and the people. The Civil War had devastated Rome's economy. Debt skyrocketed, interest rates climbed, and ordinary citizens were crushed under financial burdens they could not escape. Caesar, understanding that political stability required economic relief, introduced measures to ease public suffering. He prevented the exploitation of debtors' limited interest accumulation and allowed property to be valued at pre-war levels to reduce burdens. These reforms stabilized markets and prevented widespread social unrest. But they also angered wealthy lenders who saw their profits reduced. Once again, Caesar favored the masses over the elite, and the elite remembered. Perhaps his most controversial reform was the restructuring of the Senate. Traditionally, composed of around 600 members, the body had been dominated by old aristocratic families who guarded their status fiercely. Caesar expanded the Senate to nearly 900 members, filling it with his supporters, provincial elites, and capable administrators. His intention was clear: dilute the power of entrenched nobility and create a governing class loyal to him. To the masses, this was democratization. To the senators, it was an invasion, an assault on centuries of tradition. The Senate chamber, once a bastion of aristocratic exclusivity, now echoed with new voices, many of them chosen by Caesar rather than lineage. The old nobility felt themselves slipping into irrelevance. Despite the complaints of senators and nobles, Caesar was adored by the Roman populace. His triumphs, festivals, economic reforms, and policy of mercy won the hearts of citizens across Italy. He distributed land to veterans, reduced unemployment, rebuilt Rome's infrastructure, and sponsored large-scale public works. Crowds followed him through the streets. They hailed him as a hero, a savior, a man who restored order after decades of chaos. To them, Caesar was not a threat to the Republic. He was its rebirth. But the elite saw something very different. They saw a man whose popularity eclipsed the Senate's authority. A man who commanded armies, reshaped laws, appointed officials, and redefined citizenship. A man who restructured time, rebuilt provinces, and forgiven enemies who might now feel eternal loyalty. A man who expanded the Senate not to strengthen it, but to rule through it. To them, Caesar looked less like a dictator for life and more like a king in all but name. And for Romans, whose identity was built on the rejection of monarchy, since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud, the word king was more terrifying than any army. Caesar's vision was bold, ambitious, and transformative. But the more he tried to reshape Rome, the more he threatened the foundations of the old order. In the hearts of the elite, admiration turned to fear. Fear turned to resentment, and resentment darkened into conspiracy. Caesar had rebuilt Rome, but in doing so, he had also sealed his fate. When Julius Caesar returned from his campaigns in Spain in early 45 BCE, he was no longer simply a victorious general or a pragmatic statesman. He was the man who had reshaped Rome with the force of his will. The Senate, in gratitude, or perhaps in fear, showered him with honors, triumphs, statues, sacred seats, laurel wreaths, even the right to sit upon a golden throne during public games. But all these honors were still symbols, decorations placed upon a man who remained in theory a servant of the Republic. That illusion shattered in February of 44 BCE, when the Senate granted Caesar the unprecedented title of Dictator Perpetuo Dictator for life. Dictatorship had existed in Rome for centuries, but only as an emergency office. A dictator was appointed in times of crisis, war, invasion, rebellion, and his power lasted for 6 months at most. He possessed absolute authority, but only temporarily. After the crisis passed, the Republic reclaimed its balance. It was a system designed to preserve Rome from tyranny while allowing decisive action in moments of necessity. But with the title Dictator Perpetuo, the very foundation of that system was cracked apart. Caesar was no longer an emergency leader. He was sovereign without term limits. He did not need to step down. He did not need re-election. He did not require approval. For many Romans especially, senators steeped in tradition, this was a title that echoed a forbidden word rex king. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Rome had sworn eternal hatred toward monarchy ever since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud almost 5 centuries earlier. The Republic was built on that trauma. Every safeguard, every law, every tradition reinforced the idea that no man should hold permanent, unchecked power. Caesar, by accepting the dictatorship for life, seemed to tear up those ancient safeguards and write his own name over them. Some saw this as the natural culmination of his brilliance. Rome needed him. Others saw it as the beginning of the end. But one thing was certain: there had never been anything like this in Roman history. The Senate had voted for Caesar's title, but beneath that vote simmered fear, resentment, and a sense of impending doom. Many senators felt they were being coerced or intimidated into supporting him. Caesar's influence over the people, his control of the army, and his overwhelming prestige had made open opposition impossible. The Senate chamber no longer felt like a place of debate. It felt like a stage where all the actors performed under the shadow of one towering figure. Even men who respected Caesar's genius worried that Rome was sliding into monarchy disguised under a republican label. What terrified them most was not Caesar himself, but what would come after him. If Caesar was dictator for life, what happened when he died? Would he appoint a successor? Would power become hereditary? Would Rome become exactly what it had sworn to destroy? A monarchy wearing the clothing of a republic. To Roman aristocrats whose entire identity was tied to the Republic's traditions, the very idea was horrifying. The Republic was more than a government. It was a faith, a cultural backbone, a sacred ideal. And they believed, rightly or wrongly, that Caesar was dismantling it brick by brick with every reform, every honor, every decree that elevated him above ordinary men. Rumors spread that Caesar wanted to be king. His acceptance of divine honors statues placed among the gods a temple dedicated to his clementia priests who tended to his image made many senators uneasy. When he sat on a golden chair in the Senate, some whispered that it was a throne. When he wore a wreath, they whispered it was a crown. And when Mark Antony attempted to place a diadem on Caesar's head during the festival of Lupercalia, the crowd recoiled, and Caesar's refusal seemed almost calculated. Was it a sincere rejection of monarchy or a performance to gauge public opinion? The aristocrats did not know, but they feared they knew the answer. And fear in Rome was a dangerous thing. The more honors Caesar received, the more isolated he became. The The Senate no longer felt like a body of equals. It felt like a gathering of spectators. Caesar appointed magistrates, dictated policy, and controlled legislation. His image appeared on coins, an unprecedented act that once again signaled kingship to Roman eyes. Even the calendar bore his signature. His reforms strengthened Rome, but they also concentrated power in his hands alone. The Republic was functioning more efficiently than ever, but it was functioning because of one man, not because of its institutions. To many Romans especially, the common people and veterans who adored him, this was a blessing. Caesar brought grainland festivals, stability, and peace. He rebuilt cities, revived the economy, and ended decades of civil war. But for Rome's ancient aristocracy, every improvement felt like another step away from the world they understood. Caesar was transforming Rome into something new, a global power that needed a strong central leader. He saw monarchy not as a threat, but as a necessity for an empire stretching across continents. But the Senate clung to tradition. In their view, Caesar's vision, however brilliant, was an existential danger to Roman liberty. Behind closed doors, senators began to murmur. Some complained that Caesar ignored their advice. Others claimed he humiliated them, treating them like ceremonial figures rather than partners in governance. Whether these claims were true or products of wounded pride, they fueled discontent. The older generation remembered Sulla's dictatorship and feared another purge. The younger generation resented Caesar's dominance, believing they would never have political careers so long as he ruled. Pride, jealousy, ideology, and fear blended together into a deadly mixture. And in the shadows, a conspiracy began to take shape. Caesar's acceptance of the title Dictator Perpetuo brought the political tension in Rome to its breaking point. His vision was bold. He wanted to stabilize the Mediterranean, expand the empire into the east, reform government permanently, and unify Rome's diverse peoples under a strong central authority. In his mind, the Republic's old structure was outdated, unable to handle the challenges of a continental superpower. He believed Rome needed a single guiding hand, a leader above partisan squabbles and aristocratic egos. He believed that leader was himself. But Rome could not accept this without breaking something fundamental. The Republic was built on the idea that no man should possess permanent unchecked power. Even if Caesar used that power wisely, even if he used it brilliantly, the principle itself was dangerous. The senators feared not just Caesar, but the precedent. If one man could claim lifelong dictatorship, then what would stop his successor from doing the same? What would stop the erosion of citizen rights? What would stop Rome from becoming exactly what it had sworn to despise? Thus, Caesar and the Republic were locked in a tragic contradiction. Caesar wanted to save Rome by reshaping it. The senators wanted to save Rome by preserving it. Both sides believed they fought for Rome's future, and both sides believed the other was destroying it. The result was inevitable. As Caesar's power expanded, the Republic's defenders became desperate, and desperate men are capable of desperate acts. By the spring of 44 BCE, Caesar stood at the height of his power and at the brink of catastrophe. He held the world in his hands, but his grip on Rome's old aristocracy had never been weaker. The title Dictator Perpetuo was not merely an honor. It was the final spark in a political landscape soaked with tension. The Republic trembled. The conspirators sharpened their blades, and the Ides of March approached. While Julius Caesar walked through the streets of Rome, crowned with honors, planning reforms, and preparing new campaigns, another Rome stirred beneath the surface, one of whispers, fear, and secret hatred. In private villas, behind closed doors, and in the dimly lit corners of porticos, Men gathered with expressions tight with anxiety. Their voices were low, their meetings discreet, but their purpose was sharp as a dagger's blade to save the Republic by striking down the man they now labeled a tyrant. These were not fringe radicals. They were senators, consuls, generals, former allies, and ideological guardians of Rome's ancient traditions. Many had once admired Caesar served under him or benefited from his generosity, but now, confronted with his immense power and the title Dictator Perpetuo, they saw not a savior, but a threat, an overwhelming figure whose shadow was eclipsing Rome itself. The meetings grew more frequent. Trusted courtyards became sanctuaries for conspiracy. Guards were dismissed, slaves sent away. The conspirators spoke in coded language, circling around the subject before daring to name it outright. Even uttering possibilities of violence against a man as powerful as Caesar was dangerous. Yet slowly, the idea ceased to be unthinkable. The question no longer became, should Caesar die, but how do we kill him before Rome loses its soul? Names like Cassius Longinus, Decimus Brutus, Trebonius, Cimber, and Casca emerged as core figures, men who had grown increasingly bitter under Caesar's dominance. Some were driven by ideology, others by wounded pride, and others by personal slights. But all agreed on one thing. The Republic could not survive. One man, wielding such uninterrupted power. And so a conspiracy was born, not out of sudden rage, but out of months of tension, building into inevitability. Rome's most powerful elites became shadows in their own city, moving carefully, plotting deeply, preparing for a moment that would change history forever. Among all the names whispered in the dark, one carried a weight unlike any other: Marcus Junius Brutus. To many, he was the heart of the conspiracy, its moral justification, its symbolic anchor, its tragic necessity. His involvement turned the conspiracy from a political assassination into a narrative, almost a reenactment of Rome's oldest legend, the expulsion of the last king by the ancestors of Brutus himself. But Brutus was not an obvious enemy of Caesar. In fact, Caesar adored him. He trusted him, favored him, supported his political ascent. Some ancient authors even suggested, whether true or rumor, that Caesar might have been his biological father. What is undeniable is this: Caesar held Brutus closer perhaps than any other senator. And that closeness made Brutus the ultimate prize for the conspirators. Cassius, Brutus's brother-in-law, and an ambitious man sidelined by Caesar's rise, knew the power Brutus held, not military power, but moral authority. The Roman people respected Brutus's lineage, his philosophical temperament, his calm integrity. If Brutus stood with the conspirators, the assassination would appear not as a selfish act of rivals, but as a noble defense of liberty. And so Cassius began his campaign, not a battle of swords, but one of persuasion. He whispered to Brutus about the Republic's fragility, about the dangers of permanent dictatorship, about the shame of allowing Rome to slide into monarchy. He reminded Brutus of his heritage, the line of Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had driven out the Tarquin kings. He spoke of duty, honor, destiny. Other conspirators joined in offering flattery appeals, rational arguments, anything to pull Brutus into their cause. At first, Brutus hesitated. He respected Caesar, perhaps even loved him. The bond between them was not political convenience. It was personal. Caesar had spared Brutus in the past, forgiven him, and trusted him. Betrayal was not in Brutus's nature, but the weight of ideology pressed harder with each passing day. Rome, he believed, was bigger than any affection, any bond, any man, even Caesar. Brutus struggled. He sought guidance in philosophy, in Stoic thought, in the ideas of civic virtue. Night after night, he wrestled with the question, was killing Caesar murder or justice? The conspirators intensified their pressure. Letters were forged and left at Brutus's home, supposedly from Roman citizens, pleading with him to restore their lost freedom. These letters, thrust upon him as a proof of the people's will, tilted his heart. Eventually, the choice became unbearable. Brutus convinced himself that Caesar's death was not betrayal, but sacrifice. A sacrifice not of Caesar, but of himself, his peace, his friendship, his loyalty for the sake of Rome. And when Brutus joined the conspiracy, he became its soul. His name gave it moral legitimacy. His presence gave it courage. With Brutus aboard, the conspirators believed the gods themselves were now on their side. As winter turned to early spring in 44 BCE, Rome's political atmosphere grew suffocating. It was a city split between admiration and resentment, hope and fear, loyalty and suspicion. Caesar's power seemed absolute, yet his isolation seemed greater than ever. Senators walked with forced smiles, bowing and applauding in public, while trembling in private. Caesar's reforms, though sweeping and beneficial, were overshadowed by the looming question, what comes next when one man controls everything? Rumors swirled like dust in the forum. Some said Caesar planned to move the capital to Alexandria or Troy. Others whispered he would declare himself king during the upcoming Parthian campaign. The diadem episode during Lupercalia still haunted the Senate. Caesar's increasing divine honors, statues among gods, priests dedicated to him, only deepened their dread. Meanwhile, Caesar moved through Rome seemingly unaware of how fragile the political temperature had become. Or perhaps he knew, but dismissed the danger. He had survived civil wars, rival generals, and rebellions across the empire. Why would he fear? A few disgruntled senators. Caesar believed he had been magnanimous. He pardoned enemies, promoted former rivals, forgave insults. He could not imagine they would repay clemency with bloodshed. But the conspirators saw clemency differently. They saw humiliation. They saw themselves being kept in Caesar's shadow, alive only because he allowed it. Every pardon reminded them of their dependence on him. Every gesture of mercy reinforced his superiority. The psychological tension became unbearable. In the Senate, debates felt like performances conducted for Caesar's approval. In the Forum, crowds adored him with a fervor usually reserved for heroes or deities. Veterans hailed him as their father. Merchants thrived under his reforms. Ordinary Romans called him savior. To the conspirators, this was proof of tyranny. To Caesar, it was proof of success. The disconnect between leader and elite had grown too wide, too deep, too dangerous. By March of 44 BCE, Rome was a city waiting to explode. Every corridor in the Senate housed whispers. Every dinner party harbored tension. Every meeting of the conspirators grew more urgent. They now believed there was no turning back. If they failed, they would be hunted as traitors. If they hesitated, Caesar would cement his power beyond challenge. The window to act was shrinking. Thus they chose a day. A date written forever into the memory of the world, the Ides of March. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Rome seemed strangely calm. A soft mist clung to the streets as if the city itself was holding its breath. Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, woke early in his villa near the Tiber River. His wife Calpurnia had spent the night restless, haunted by terrifying dreams. Images of Caesar bleeding in her arms, the house collapsing and a statue of Caesar dripping with blood. When she awoke trembling, she begged him not to go to the Senate meeting that day. She claimed the omens were too dark, too overwhelming to ignore. For a moment, Caesar hesitated. He had always been skeptical of dark prophecies, yet the anxiety in Calpurnia's voice tugged at him. Giving in to her fears, he decided to send word to the Senate he would not attend. But before the messenger could leave Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators and one of Caesar's most trusted friends arrived. Calm, persuasive, almost brotherly Decimus assured Caesar that the Senate had important business to finalize. If he stayed home, it would appear he was bowing to superstition, something unworthy of a man of his stature. He insisted that the senators might even misinterpret his absence as arrogance or contempt. Caesar, always sensitive to appearances and honor, relented. He dismissed the messenger and told Calpurnia he would go. Then, with a final attempt to reassure her, he said half-mockingly that death came to all men better to face it once than fear it always. With that, he wrapped himself in his crimson-bordered toga, stepped into his litter, and made his way through the streets of Rome, unaware that every step carried him closer to eternity. The Senate meeting was not held in its usual location on the Capitol. Instead, it took place at the Theater of Pompey, in a hall adorned with statues of Pompey the Great, the man Caesar had once called friend, then enemy, and ultimately defeated. The symbolism would soon become chillingly clear. As Caesar entered the hall, nearly 60 conspirators began to close in around him, forming what looked like an eager escort. Caesar greeted some of them warmly, completely unaware of the daggers hidden beneath their togas. He moved toward his gilded seat, ironically placed beneath a giant statue of Pompey, when one of the conspirators, Tullius Cimber, approached with a feigned plea. He asked Caesar to reverse the exile of his brother. Caesar refused. Cimber stepped closer, grabbing Caesar's toga as though begging. At that moment, everything erupted. Casca struck first, slashing at Caesar's neck. Caesar reacted instinctively, seizing Casca's arm and shouting, "Villain, what are you doing?" Then the other conspirators rushed forward. Daggers flashed like lightning. Steel pierced flesh. The air filled with the chaos of gasps, grunts, the shuffling of sandals, and the sickening sound of blades cutting into a man who had survived countless battlefields. Caesar tried to fight back at first. Years of military command had conditioned him to react with instinctive courage, but there were too many. Their bodies pressed around him, their arms rising and falling in a frenzy. His blood splattered across the marble floor. His toga tore. The senators, men he had forgiven, promoted, trusted, stabbed him with a fury that bordered on madness. When the attack subsided, Caesar had been stabbed 23 times. Only one wound, the second, was truly fatal. The others were frantic strikes from men desperate to leave their mark on history. As his strength failed, Caesar stumbled backward toward Pompey's statue. Blood pooled at his feet, staining the floor beneath Rome's most iconic conqueror. And then came the most iconic moment of all. As the daggers rose and fell, Caesar's eyes scanned the faces around him. Faces of men he had known for decades. But when he saw Marcus Junius Brutus, the man he loved like a son, arm raised with a dagger, something shattered within him. Ancient sources differ about what Caesar said, if he said anything at all. Shakespeare gave us the immortal line, "Et tu, Brute," even you, Brutus, a phrase that has echoed across centuries as the ultimate cry of betrayal. But Latin historians recorded different accounts. Some said Caesar uttered nothing. Others said he whispered in Greek, "Kai su teknon, you too, my child." Regardless of the exact words, the meaning is unmistakable. The moment Caesar saw Brutus among his assassins, he stopped resisting. His final act was not of fear or anger, but of heartbreak. He pulled his toga over his head, an ancient gesture to preserve dignity in death, and collapsed beneath Pompey's statue. Legend says the blood from Caesar's wounds splashed onto Pompey's feet, as though the old general, even in death, was avenged. When Caesar fell, the Senate chamber descended into pandemonium. The assassins, their hands dripping with blood, shouted liberty, freedom. The Republic is restored. They expected cheers, a triumphant reaction, perhaps even celebration. Instead, panic rippled across Rome. Senators not involved in the plot fled the hall screaming. People barricaded themselves in their homes. Bloodshed had erupted at the heart of Roman politics, and no one knew what would follow. The conspirators marched through the streets, waving their daggers like trophies, chanting that tyranny had ended. But the Roman people did not rejoice. They had loved Caesar deeply, fiercely, sometimes blindly. He had forgiven debts, expanded citizenship, given them land grain and glory. To the common people, Caesar was not a tyrant. He was their champion. By nightfall, Rome trembled on the edge of collapse. Caesar's body lay abandoned on the Senate floor until 3 slaves quietly carried him home. His wife Calpurnia received him with a wail that echoed through the villa. Meanwhile, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, hid in fear, unsure whether he would be the conspirators' next target. The Liberatores. Brutus Cassius and their allies believed they had saved the Republic, but they had miscalculated profoundly. They killed Caesar the man, but unleashed Caesar the legend. In the days to come, Rome would erupt into riots. Antony would seize the moment and deliver one of the most powerful speeches in human history. Octavian Caesar's young calculating heir would rise. Brutus and Cassius would flee, then die. And in a twist, drenched in tragic irony, Caesar's death would not save the Republic. It would doom it. The Ides of March did not restore liberty. It destroyed the last chance for peace. And from Caesar's blood-soaked toga, the Roman Empire would be born. When Julius Caesar fell beneath the blades of the conspirators on the Ides of March, the men who struck him believed fervently, desperately, that they were saving the Roman Republic. They imagined that by killing one man, they could kill ambition itself. That by silencing Caesar's voice, they could restore an old world already dying. But history, ever merciless and ever ironic, had other plans. Caesar's death did not rescue the Republic. It unleashed the very chaos the conspirators feared most. Rome did not return to its ancient virtues. It descended into one of the darkest, bloodiest civil wars in its history. Streets that had once celebrated triumphant legions now echoed with the cries of citizens killing citizens. Families divided, armies clashed. The Senate, once the proud guardian of Roman liberty, became a stage for power struggles and brutal purges. And hanging over it all was the ghost of Caesar, the vacuum he left behind, impossible to fill. Those who murdered him were not prepared for the political storm that followed. Brutus and Cassius fled east, gathering soldiers, but losing legitimacy with every step. Mark Antony Caesar's loyal friend and political genius seized control of the moment. And then came the most unexpected force of all. Octavian, the teenage heir, Caesar named in his will, quiet but relentless, underestimated by all, until it was too late. The war that followed reshaped Rome forever. The conspirators fell. Rome convulsed. And when the dust finally settled, it was not Brutus, not Cassius, not Pompey, not Cato, none of the champions of the old Republic who rose from the ashes. It was Octavian, reborn as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. From Caesar's blood, an empire was forged. The Roman Empire, built on the foundations Caesar laid, would endure for more than 400 years in the West and over 1,000 years in the East. Through Augustus Trajan, Hadrian, Constantine, Marcus Aurelius, Caesar's influence, his vision echoed across centuries. The conspirators had feared Caesar would make himself king. Instead, by killing him, they ensured Rome would have emperors for almost half a millennium. But Caesar's immortality did not end with politics. His legacy seeped into every aspect of civilization. His Julian calendar, designed to fix the chaos of Roman timekeeping, remains the direct ancestor of the calendar we use today. Only slight adjustments in 1582 turned it into the modern Gregorian system. When you look at today's date, you are reading Caesar's work. Roman law, refined during and after Caesar's reforms, became the backbone of Western legal systems. Concepts like contracts, citizenship, property rights, and legal procedure all carry Roman DNA. Caesars. Rome still breathes in modern courts and parliaments. Even the word Caesar transformed into a symbol of power. In German, it became Kaiser. In Russian, Tsar. Both titles used by emperors who ruled continents trace their origin to one man. Cities he founded, especially Alexandria, became centers of knowledge, science, astronomy, and philosophy. His writings on the Gallic Wars became textbooks for military strategy for 2,000 years. His leadership inspired Napoleon Washington Churchill, countless figures who studied him not as a relic of the past, but as a model of ambition made flesh. Julius Caesar lived only 55 years, but he shaped 2,000. He was brilliant, flawed, compassionate, ruthless visionary, terrifying, inspiring all at once. He could command armies with a glance, forgive enemies with a generosity that defied logic, and reshape entire nations with the sweep of a pen. He was the kind of man history gives us only once, in an age too brilliant to be ordinary, too ambitious to be contained, too dangerous to be ignored. And that is why the final message of his life, the truth that outlived the Republic, the Empire, and every dagger raised against him, is this: Caesar died, but Rome, the Rome he imagined built, reformed, revolutionized, did not. Rome lived. Rome flourished. Rome became eternal, and Caesar's shadow still stretches across it all. Thank you for joining me on this long, emotional, and powerful journey through the life of one of history's greatest figures. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something new, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who loves history as much as we do. The world of ancient history is vast, dramatic, and endlessly fascinating, and I can't wait to explore it with you again. See you in the next video. We will continue our journey to discover the people who shaped human history.